Hi quilters, this is our 6th video in a series designed to use leftover 2.5-inch strips of fabric. At the beginning, I did a great sorting, and my two favorite strip buckets were the Halloween one and my Christmas one. I've been looking for the right project to make with these strips, and I found this pattern from Moda and Zen Chic called Smoothie Time. I knew it would be perfect for these strips, and since I couldn't decide to do Halloween or Christmas, I decided, of course, to do them both. The first thing I had to do was to sort through all the strips. I pulled the ones out that best fit the Halloween theme. Some of the more plain fabrics or neutral fabrics I left in the bucket to make a colorful fall quilt in the future. Since the Smoothie Time pattern is perfect for a jelly roll, it also means it'll work for leftover strips. You can use any color combination that you want. Just pick a more limited palette or combo to suit your tastes. I thought about doing this one in all browns and creams or in black and pink, but I decided to use the seasonal fabrics instead. When picking out your strips, make sure they measure longer than 7 inches. Once you have your strips picked out, just start sewing them together into sets of 2 strips roughly the same length. Mix and match the designs and colors as you go to get a good variety in your quilt. Use 1/4-inch seam allowances throughout this quilt top. When I was sewing strips together, sometimes I would just trim one of the strips to match the other strip. Other times, especially with longer strips, I would just find another fabric strip in a different color and keep on sewing. I can cut them apart later. There is no need to press before you sew. When we do the first seam press, it'll also flatten all the strips and make them lay nice and flat, so no need to iron twice. I did not use my entire Halloween strip stash. I just sewed until all the strictly Halloween fabric strips were used. I figured I could always use some of the plainer fabrics later to supplement the sections if I don't have enough for the quilt top. I love this kind of mindless sewing. It's very relaxing for me, and I get to take a trip down memory lane trying to remember the original project some of these strips came from. Sometimes I can remember and sometimes I can't. We will leave a link in the description below for you to find the pattern to print at home. Once all your strips are sewn into sets of 2, it's time to head to the ironing board for the first pressing. When I get to the ironing board, the first thing I'm going to do is press the strip set flat, and then I'll open it up and press it towards the darker fabric. Some of my strips were really wrinkly, or former binding strips with a crease down the center. For those strips, I used Mary Ellen's Best Press Spray to help them lay nice and flat. By pressing at this stage, we can do all of the rest of the strip set sewing before we have to press again. Once all the strip sets are pressed, it'll be time to head back to the sewing machine. Each of these strip sets should measure 4.5 inches wide. It's time to sew these sets of 2 into sets of 6. I tried to match them up by length as best that I could. When sewing the sets to each other, nest the center seam together. This will help with the final pressing. It'll make it easier to press all the seams in one direction. Sometimes I could fit 2 shorter sets onto the same long set. I would cut it apart later, and that helps me get a little bit more variety in my strip sets. I would sew 2 strip sets together, and then I would send another set of 2 through the machine. I would then cut the first one off from the front, open it up, and then add the third set of strips to it to get 6 strips as a unit. I tried really hard to spread around the colors and the designs in the strip sets. Occasionally, a larger strip set was sewn to a smaller one. It's all good. I will just keep sewing them into sets that have 6 strips. So far, I'm showing all of the steps to you using the Halloween fabrics, but you'll also see my Christmas version at the end. You'll want to stay to the end to see the bonus projects too. They were made with the leftovers from this project. If you're enjoying our series of videos for using 2.5-inch leftover strips, we hope you'll hit the like button and subscribe to see all the future videos. We will leave a link in the description below for the strip video playlist on our channel. The Smoothie Time pattern uses 1 jelly roll and has blocks that finish at 12 inches by 12 inches or 12.5 inches before they're sewn together. But by using leftover strips, you can make it any size that you want. Just make as many blocks as you need to make it the size that you want. The original pattern is set with 4 blocks in 4 rows. So you have 16 blocks total, and the finished size is 48.5 by 48.5. But if you wanted to, you could make 20 blocks, set it 4 by 5 for a quilt that measures 48 by 60. And it goes up from there. You can do 5 by 5 for 25 blocks, and the quilt measures 60 inches by 60 inches. 30 blocks set 5 by 6 would equal a quilt that's 60 by 72. 36 blocks set 6 by 6 would be a square quilt 72 by 72. 42 blocks set 6 by 7 will be a quilt measuring 72 by 84. Use as many scraps as you want to make it as small or as large as you like. Once you've used up all your strip sets of 2 and made strip sets of 6, it'll be time to head to the ironing board. Each of these strip sets should be 12.5 inches wide. It's looking good so far. If you nested all your seams in the previous section, 3 of the 5 seams are all pressed in one direction. Now you just need to press the other 2 in the same direction as the first 3. I usually press from the back side first, and then if I'm afraid I've pressed in any creases in the front, I will also press it from the front. Now that all the pressing is done, it's time to head to the cutting mat. We are going to cut chunks that are 6.5 inches wide from each of these strip sets. You'll need to trim off one end first to get a nice flat place to set your ruler from, and then just cut 6.5-inch sections. Cut as many sections as you can from each strip set. Sometimes I was only able to get 1 or 2, sometimes I was able to get 3 or 4. When I couldn't get any more 6.5-inch wide sections, I cut sections that were 2.5-inch wide or the largest size I could get. And also, of course, I saved all the leftover pieces. There was very little waste when I made this project. Now I have a pile of 6.5-inch sections, enough to make 25 blocks, plus the leftover of 2.5-inch wide pieces, odd-sized pieces, and then, of course, little pieces that I will use for something. I don't know what yet, but 2.5-inch wide and other sizes for just playing with. Now it's just a matter of sewing 2 sections together. They're all 6.5-inch wide, and then once you sew them together, they should be blocks that are 12.5 inches wide. Randomly choose 2 sections and piece them together with right sides together. Because they all have the seams pressed in one direction, rotate the sections as needed so the seams will nest together as you sew. If you have the seam on top facing toward the sewing machine, it will help push the top seam to nest into the bottom seam. Once all your blocks are sewn, it's time to cut them apart. I like using my handy blade saver to get the job done. Then it'll be time to head to the ironing board. At this point, you can press the seams to one side, or if you prefer, you could press the seams open. Next, we will sew the blocks together to make rows, alternating the direction of the blocks. If you are making a quilt with an even number of blocks, for example 4 by 4, just sew all of the blocks into sets of 2. If you are making a quilt with an odd number of blocks, set aside enough blocks to match the number of rows that you will have, and then piece the remainder of the blocks into sets of 2. Before I started sewing, I pinned all the sets of 2. That way I knew I would do them all the same. Sew the sets of 2 into sets of 4. Once I have them sewn into sets of 4, I will need to add the last block in each of these rows. 3 of them will have the blocks going one direction, and 2 of them will have the blocks going in the other direction. My quilt will have a total of 25 blocks, 5 rows of 5. For my rows, I am going to press the blocks that are parallel to the row towards the blocks that are perpendicular to the row. Once you get done pressing, then it's time to lay out the rows and make sure you like how they're going to go together before you start sewing. I like to lay down on the floor and take a picture of it and then look at the picture on the phone to decide if I've got it laid out correctly. I always see something on the phone that I don't necessarily see when I just look at it in person. I highly recommend pinning the rows together before you sew them. Once all the rows are together, it's time to do a final pressing. I pressed it from the back side first, using a little Mary Ellen's Best Press spray to help those seams lay nice and flat, and then I flipped it over to the front just to give it one final go over. For my Christmas version, my box was a little bit fuller than my Halloween version, so I made a few more strip sets for this one. I tried to stick to the more traditional Christmas colors, the greens and the reds, but I also threw in a few black and blue strips too. My stack of 6.5-inch wide cuts was a lot taller for this version. And of course, I also cut 2.5-inch wide sections when I couldn't get the bigger pieces and the little odd sizes as well. No waste! For my Christmas quilt version, I ended up making around 47 blocks. So I decided to go with a 6 by 7, so it'll be 72 by 84. But then at the end, I decided I wanted to break it up a little bit more. So I added a border kind of between the last row of blocks all the way around. I decided it was going to be a little bit too busy without a border in there, so I just stuck a 4-inch border and I did it in a dark green just to give your eye a little place to rest. So what did I do with all those extra little pieces that I cut? I ended up having enough pieces that were 2.5-inch wide of both the Halloween and the Christmas to make a runner. And then with the other leftover pieces, I just sewed them together and put them in my extra block bucket to save for a future project. My extra block bucket is the place where I put all my spare blocks left over from all my projects. I add in any test blocks or extra parts or things that I just try for the fun of it. It just has a little bit of everything in there. The bucket isn't full yet, but someday when I can't get the lid on it anymore, I'll take out all the blocks and make something really fun. Here are the leftover pieces that I just sewed together for fun. I also was able to make some 4 patches and a smaller section of the Halloween fabric, and I just had half of a block left over from the Halloween. From the Christmas fabric, I had 5 leftover blocks, along with this leftover section of the various sized with the pieces, and then I also was able to find some 4 patches to make. I already have the runners quilted and bound. I used fabric from my strip buckets for the binding, and I think they look pretty fantastic for just being spare parts. I machine quilted the Halloween quilt with a big loop pattern done in an orange thread. The Christmas quilt was quilted in a smaller loop pattern with a green thread. And here is the finished Halloween quilt. It turned out to be 5 rows of 5 blocks and finished at 60 inches by 60 inches. For the binding, I just picked out whatever black fabric I had in the Halloween bucket, sewed it end to end together to make a piece long enough to bind the quilt. So the entire quilt front and binding are all made from my 2.5-inch strip bucket of Halloween fabric. For the backing, I used one of my favorite Halloween prints, and I pieced it so you can't even tell where it seamed. I was really proud of that. I like using big bold prints on the back so the quilt can be two-sided. And here is the finished Christmas quilt. This one ended up being 6 blocks across plus that border and 7 blocks down, so 7 rows plus the border. The finished size of this one is 80 inches by 92 inches. And for this one, I decided to use red for the binding. I just picked red strips from my Christmas bucket of various lengths, sewed them together end to end to get a piece long enough to go all the way around the quilt. For the backing, I just picked a big floral to make it two-sided. And now it's time for an update on the strip bucket. So before I made these 2 quilts, the Halloween and Christmas versions, I had 7 buckets of fabric with 2.5-inch strips. I'm happy to report I'm now down to 5 buckets. I think that is fantastic. We will see you next month for another project using 2.5-inch strips. Maybe we can get it down to 4 buckets. We hope you'll remember to hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!